Hello, 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 everyone. It's Susie McMahon, and I'm welcoming you tonight to our virtual book club. I'm getting all my backup technology going here. It is time for us to meet again with our featured author, Jeffrey Blount. Hello, Jeffrey.
Hi,
Welcome back.
Susie. Hi, Francine. Thank you.
I'm so glad you're here. We're going to be discussing Jeffrey's novel, Mr. Jimmy from Around the Way. This is the second time we have featured Jeffrey in our book club. The first time was back in 2020. So
Right.
Francine is here, whichever way I have to point. There we go, opposite. And Francine Katzen, you guys know her as a group expert. She's been part of our virtual book club since 2020 and an avid author supporter. And Francine, thanks so much for coming and joining us this evening.
Thank you for allowing me to join you both. This is
Yeah.
quite an honor.
It's going to be a wonderful conversation. I just want to remember all the viewers that come on. If you could just tell us where you're watching from and make sure to ask any questions that you're interested in asking so that I can try to manage them as they flow in. But with no further ado, Francine, I'm going to have you read Jeffrey's bio and we'll get this evening started. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Jeffrey Blount is the award-winning author of 3 novels. His most recent book, The Emancipation of Evan Wells, was the winner of the 2020 National Indie Excellence Award for African American Fiction. He is an Emmy Award-winning television director and a 2016 inductee to the Virginia Communications Hall of Fame. During a 34-year career at NBC News, Jeffrey directed a decade of Meet the Press and The Today Show, NBC Nightly News, and major special events. He is the first African American to direct The Today Show. Jeffrey is also an award-winning documentary scriptwriter for films and interactives that are now on display in the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. A Virginia native, he graduated from Virginia Commonwealth University with a degree in communications, broadcast journalism. Born and raised in Smithville, Virginia, he now lives in Washington, D.C. Thank you, Jeffrey, for joining us.
Thank you, Francine, for having me.
It's fantastic. I think we need to start off with huge congratulations to you personally, if we can. Do you want to share the exciting reason why you're in California right now?
Absolutely. I'm normally in Washington, D.C. I'm in California and L.A. Because my wife and I have been out here for a week and a half or so because we just became grandparents for the first time. Jana May Kelly, Kenny, was born on August 29th. And we have just been in love and just enjoying every second we get to spend with her. So it's wonderful to be out here.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us when you are balancing all of your wonderful family experiences right now. So I just wanted to start off right away, and I know we've talked about this before, but for anyone that's watching the replay or coming on who hasn't read Mr. Jimmy from Around the Way, when exactly did this story start in your writing life? And then when did you actually really finish the project? And just kind of give us an overview of Mr. Jimmy from Around the Way's history, back history.
Yeah, Mr. Jimmy from Around the Way actually began before I left NBC. So actually before the other book, The Emancipation of Evan Wells, came out. And it began really as an idea when I recognized what I was doing with that other book in terms of trying to raise a situation and make people think about it, to bring it out to the public and have people talk about it and try to do something to help the kids that were represented in this book. And at that time, I kind of realized that when I left the news business, I wanted to be an activist through my literature. And I had already begun to think about the kinds of things I wanted to talk about in a book. The kinds of things, the stories that I wanted to tell that would get messages across. But that's as far as it had gotten, because I had been out on tour with the other book, and then that tour was cut short by COVID. And then when we were sort of sitting at home, Jean and I, and sitting on the porch and just talking and relaxing, little by little, I was wondering what I wanted to write about. And I was thinking things like, well, if COVID's only going to allow me to write one more book, what would it be like? And then Jean and I had this conversation about her when she was a reporter traveling down in Louisiana, and she got lost, and she came across this incredible rural poverty. And she called me and she said she was just stunned and couldn't believe that we had this kind of poverty in the United States. And it reminded me of some rural poverty that I had seen and grown up around with. And I thought, well, this is one of the things that I need to talk about, that I've been feeling about. And over time, and just being in that COVID, situation by myself or with Jean sitting on the porch just thinking, the book started to come to life. More things that I wanted to talk about came to life. And I started to think, well, I have all these issues now: healthcare, housing, education, and all this stuff that's coming to life. Each one could be its own book. What am I going to do? And then I realized that in any given community, all of these issues are there. And even in a well-to-do community, all these issues are there. But for these people, it's life and death many times. Is hope and failure. All these things are tied together. And so Mr. Jimmy has sort of a long trail of pieces coming together. And then, I finished it probably a year and a half into COVID. So 2021, halfway through that year. Uh-oh, I lost Susie.
No worries, no worries. I was just muted because of background TV noise in the household. But thank you so much for that. Francine, what question do you have for Jeffrey this evening, right off the bat?
I want to know if you wrote the story from start to finish. Did you have the middle? Did you know how it was going to end? How do you plot out your book? How'd you plot out this book?
So I never write with an outline. I know where I'm going to start, and I know where I hope to end, and then I just start writing. And I will sometimes, I'll get to end of one chapter and I'll do kind of a synopsis of the next chapter, so I can, because I always have so much stuff going on in my head. In order to keep it clean and simple, I'll write a synopsis of the next chapter. This is where I want to go. But I always leave room for things to come up and change my mind. Situations that I had planned will still occur, but then I'll say to myself, but it would be better if it went this way. Or a lot of authors will say, the characters will say, it'll be better if I go this way. So I have an idea where I want to end, and then I just jump in and I swim and see what comes along. And I feel it. I try to feel the story, where would I want it to go? What kind of emotions do I want to create at this particular point to move the plot along? How do I want readers to feel at this point? And I know when I've achieved that, because I always use this rule that Robert Frost says, that if there's no tears in the writer, there are no tears in the reader. If there's no excitement in the writer, there's no excitement in the reader. So as I write, I continually have to meet that level. And but that's how I do it. It's really a matter of me feeling my way through this story that I have in my mind. And I don't want to be locked down by an outline or anything like that.
Thank you so much for that. That's amazing. It's always fun for me to hear how organized and set people are with their writing process versus letting things flow like that. Thank you so much. So Jeffrey, you spoke about the word tears. And when I read your book, especially towards the end, I experienced a lot of tears. I think a lot of them had to do with your story explanation of being the character being a young child and experiencing life experience. I keep saying the word experiences, but the experience with the bird, the swallow.
Yeah.
Was that something from your own life, or was that imaginary or created by you?
The bird is from my own life. And that was an experience I had. And I have carried that with me my whole life. And it never seemed appropriate for anything other than, as Mr. Jimmy's father said to him in the book, this bird has taught you something about your character. and who you want to be and where you can't go. And so it's been a measure for me all my life about where I can go and who I am and what I will stand for and what I can't do and what I won't do. What is the moral line for me? And that little bird helped teach me all of that. And I never thought I'd really use it in a book. I think probably the only person that I told this to would be my wife. I don't even think I told my parents about it at the time. It was just something I experienced and went through. But as I was going into the book, I got to the point where I needed Mr. Jimmy's daughters to recognize that he was this good person at his core, and that he had a situation where his goodness was challenged, and he decided which way he wanted to go from that point on, and it would affect his life. And, it would make him the father that he was. It would make him the man that he was in Ham, Mississippi, and around the way. So you never know when the pieces of your life fall into place in the middle of a story, but that one did for me. And I think, if you felt it, I'm glad, because I really wanted people to see him, to see into his core, and to see that he had recognized what was real and what was true and how he should live his life. And not only in just how he saw himself treating the bird, but how, that was a reflection of how he must treat human beings going forward.
Mm-hmm. Oh. Can I ask a question?
Yes,
you may. Lovely.
I think I've heard you talk about this before, about the influences your father had on you, about treating other people like you want to be treated. I think we've talked about this before.
Yeah.
And if you could speak a little bit about him and how he raised you, because I think we've talked about this, that's what my dad told me. You treat people as you want to be treated. It doesn't matter whether they're the clerk in a store or they're an executive. But my dad felt like everybody was equal, and it didn't matter the position, the color, anything. So I think you came from a similar background.
I did, and I wanted to put that into Mr. Jimmy. My dad is 98 now, and we visit every Wednesday when I go to see him, and we have nice long conversations. And he constantly reminds me. I mean, he constantly is my North Star on how to be the person I want to be. And he was that influence. Mr. Jimmy in the book is highly influenced by his parents and how they are trying to have him see the world and through the eyes of people who are less fortunate than he is. And my father was a small farmer. My mother was a church kindergarten teacher. So nobody was making a lot of money. But everybody always said, we thought your family was rich. And I think it's because it's how my parents kind of held themselves, and how all this love and good feeling from them was radiating all the time to people. And my father in particular had 3 sons who he wanted to influence. And he lived a good life, and he expected us to live that good life and how we treated other people. And he would constantly tell us that we could be so much more than he could have been in his life for many different reasons. And he wanted that for us. But first and foremost, he wanted us to be good men, and he wanted us to be good people, And so I like to say my father, I remember a day when I was walking to my great grandmother's house, and 2 women who I didn't really know were sitting on the front porch. And I passed by the house, and I heard one woman say to the other, "That's one of Edward Blount's boys." And when they said it, they had this kind of respect, and even she was smiling a little bit. And when I heard her, I turned and smiled and nodded, and they waved, and I moved on. But at that moment, I recognized that my father had he had gone in and opened the door and set the way for me. So, I mean, he had made it easier for me to step into my adult life and my older life by being the person he was. Because now everybody else, expected the same from me, and it was easier to walk into that because he did that. So I would say my father taught me that generational wealth is is more than about just money.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I love that. Thank you for asking that question, Francine. And Jeffrey, what I love also about the story is it's a shot of wake up medicine for those of us that may not have driven into an area like that in Mississippi, or I can relate to places outside of Atlanta through rural Georgia into South Carolina. Do you think it's a huge issue still in the United States of America that we have that kind of poverty?
I do think it's a huge issue. I think it's getting worse. Recently we were watching television and we saw, it's one of those ads that you saw when we were growing up, give to the children of Africa, give a $1 here and $1 there to kids in the Middle East or whatever. And there is an organization that's now asking for the same thing in the United States of America. And that was stunning to me to see that. It's stunning to me to find out watching 60 Minutes that Doctors Without Borders that group is operating in the United States of America. And we think of them being in developing countries where people don't have health care and everything. But in this 60 Minutes piece, people were walking from other places to come to this place where they could get free health care, free dental care, and all those kinds of things in our country. And in some of those situations in Mr. Jimmy in the book, where people are cooking in these horrible conditions, and the only water they can drink, they catch in these big barrels outside of their homes, and the barrels are full of other junk. They literally have holes in the walls of their homes. This is now. Recently on a CBS Evening News piece, someone had gone into one of those homes and one of those neighborhoods, and where people had dug holes in the background. That's where they were going to the bathroom. And some people had these kind of plastic pipes that they had run out of the back of toilets into the backyard where kids were playing. And so they went in and put in septic systems into some of these houses. But that tells us what we don't want to see oftentimes. And one of the reasons I wrote Mr. Jimmy from Around the Way is to take people there. Because I know most people, our lives are so busy, people have good hearts. And you see it in instances and those random acts of kindness, you see that. But we often don't have time to recognize that there are people living a mile or 2 or 3 away from us who are living as if they're in developing countries, without running water, without electricity, even with dirt floors today. So these are some of the things that I wanted people to think about when they finished reading Mr. Jimmy.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think I've seen that same special, and it's a kind of busy year that we have going on with politics, and it's definitely something that should be discussed and brought to the forefront. Francine, what other question do you have for Jeffrey? And then I've got a list of them that I need to.
I want to know, did you pick out this cover? I love it. Did you have any input with it?
I had input only in that, I will tell you that when they finished with this, and I fell in love with it, but I called my agent, Marley Rusoff, and I said, Marley, the last book had a house on it on the cover too. Is this too much? And she said, no, it's a beautiful cover. So I gave them a couple of ideas, one of which was Mr. Jimmy's house that was rebuilt. Mm-hmm. But there were others. There was one, I gave them an idea of a man walking along a dirt road, looking as if he was going somewhere. There was almost a graphic novel kind of thing where there was a man pulling a suitcase and there was this long winding string of a road leading to a house off in the distance. So I gave them a whole bunch of ideas. And then the folks at Beaufort Book came back with that, and I was just absolutely in love with it. And and when I sent it around to my family, my daughter, who probably would be the most critical of all of us, when she loved it, I knew I was doing okay.
Hit the jackpot.
Yes.
Good.
To kind of segue off of that, I think that the cover helps my imagination or my mind when you're describing, you're using your incredible visualization almost of where the home was and where Ham is and everything. I could just see it developing before me. The other thing I wanted to talk about that really hit home for me personally was the engine check.
Oh,
Waking up every day. I loved her analogy and the way that she coached Mr. Jimmy around that. Where did that idea come from? And every morning when I wake up, I kind of mentally do that.
well, I can tell you somebody's going to love that. So my oldest friend, 50 years or more friendship, my brother from another mother, and his name is Perry Nick Bell. We went to high school together, and we have been friends and really brothers for all of my life. And he used to say that all the time. And I call him and I say, "How are you doing?" And he said, "Well, check my water pressure, blood pressure, air pressure. I'm doing all right." So so that's over 40 years he'd be saying that.
Yeah.
And I used to say it to him. And so when the book came up, and again, I'm writing the book and I get to this point where I need something. I want Miss Septima to say something meaningful that means something about how she gets through the night and gets through the day. So I called Perry and I said, "Would you mind if I used your phrasing in the book?" And he said, "No, I'd be honored." And then when I finished, I told him the last thing people will read is air pressure, blood pressure, water pressure. That's the last line in the book. And so he's very pleased. And I went actually to my hometown and did a book event, and he was there. And I made sure everybody knew that he added a very special part to Mr. Jimmy from around the way.
Wonderful. And when you've been out promoting the book, I know that when you were promoting Emancipation of Evan Walls, you would have a lot of feedback from the audience members saying, "Hey, this is my life. You're telling my story." Have you experienced the same kind of experience when you've been out promoting? Or tell us a little bit more about what you're experiencing with this specific novel when you're out with readers and the public.
Well, I only had one situation, and I don't really want to say which city I was in, where someone came to me and talked about her life and in that moment in her life, and talking about why she came when she read what the book was about and what the library said I was going to talk about. And she wanted to hear what I had to say about how she was living her life, and the people she knew were living their lives. And so she said, while I spoke about a very different situation, she was in an urban situation rather than a rural situation. She thanked me for making people realize that not everybody has an easy life, and that some lives are very difficult, and sometimes people don't know who to turn to. And the most beautiful thing that happened that night, so I'm always talking about Mr. Jimmy inspiring people to do good things and that sort of thing. So sometimes you go to a book event, some people have read the book and want to meet the author. Sometimes they're just coming to hear an author speak, and then maybe they buy the book or not. So there was a gentleman there and a woman who had read the book already, and they had some great questions. And this woman stood up, and what she told me personally, she began to speak about it in front of the group of people. And while she was talking about this health problem she was having, and she couldn't get anybody to see her. She didn't have any money to do this and that kind of thing. And she was emotionally just distraught. So one of the guys stood up and said, "You know what? I'm a psychologist, and here's what I'm going to do. You can come and see me." And then the person at the library said, "We have someone here because of the community we're in that's here to help people with some of these situations. And I'd like you to speak to her too." So in that moment, I began to see Mr. Jimmy come to life. Everything I wanted to happen as a writer when people read these books and finish, and I want them to feel motivated to go out and do something, in my book talk, I was seeing it happen. And so when we left that night, I walked away, and this woman was in the hands of a psychologist and the one of the top people at the library who works with this woman who they have because of the neighborhood and the area that they're in. And so I left knowing that she was going to be in good hands. So that's a wonderful thing. Otherwise, people with this book were just very interested to know what we were talking about earlier, that these things existed, that people like this were still existed in our country. And then what could we do to help? And so, we would have that conversation.
That's amazing. Francine, do you have a follow-up?
I can't imagine how you felt as an author watching all of that unfold and just feeling like your heart was full because of writing this book and wanting those kind of things to come. I mean, that is a wonderful, wonderful story. I love that.
Yeah, and Francine, there's no, I'm like anybody else. I write a book and it sells, and I like royalties too. But that is the greatest royalty of all. You sit down and you write, and you have a mission, and you want to have, particularly me, when I talk about being an activist writer, I want to motivate people. And then you're just up having this conversation and talking to people about what you want to do and how you want to do it. And it's almost like at church when I was growing up, and somebody would get up and say to the minister, "Can I speak to the church?" And she got up and she spoke, and the folks rose to the occasion. It was beautiful.
It's wonderful.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. Go ahead.
Oh, do you, maybe it's too soon to ask you, but as much as we all love this book, do you have another book that's ready to come out soon?
Not ready to come out soon. No, but I'm working on another one, and it will be, it's a historical fiction or historical biography. It's not Evan Walls or Mr. Jimmy from around the way, in the sense that there are particular contemporary issue that I want to talk about. This is about a slave who was born on a Georgia plantation, who would grow up to become the first captain of a U.S. military vessel, and the revenue cutters, which is called the Coast Guard. Which became the Coast Guard. And this book is about hopes and dreams. This book is about looking at people and not judging a book by its cover. And the ultimate way of thinking of that is, here's someone who was enslaved and people thought of as a slave, but people thought of as a less than human being, and became one of the most dynamic and powerful people in our country at a certain point, because he was in the upper Northwest, where there wasn't a whole lot of government oversight or police or anything like that. And he became kind of the sheriff, if you want to call it, of the area, even though he spent most of his time out on the water in an icebreaker. And he saved, and this man saved groups of indigenous people. This man saved so many other people who were out on the water and all that kind of stuff. His name is Michael Healy. Today, the Coast Guard has one icebreaker in its fleet, and it is named the Healy. And so his story is a huge, it's a big story, which I'm going to have to narrow it down to tell it, I think, properly for people to get it. Otherwise, I'd have to do volume 10. But I do think it's a beautiful story, and I think it's a story, if I'm thinking about it in an activism kind of way, it's a story for us to recognize the contributions that we're all capable of, and to not deny anybody that opportunity. All of us are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and we benefit when we allow people to have those dreams and to make the most out of their dignity and their rights.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you have mentioned several times, and I'm getting ready, I wanted to remind everyone watching, and anyone that watches the YouTube recording later, that Jeffrey is one of our featured authors for the 2025 Lowcountry Literary and Leisure Getaway down in Beaufort, South Carolina. And each of those authors are going to have an activity or an intimate conversation specifically for the getaway guests. And I believe, Jeffrey, your theme is activism in your writing. Can you tell us a little bit more where this came from, and why it's so close to your heart, and what you hope to achieve in activism in your writing?
Well, when I was a little kid, I read Black Boy by Richard Wright, and it became my second Bible. So I was having some of the issues that the character in The Emancipation of Evan Wells had, and I needed, it's not that I wasn't getting love from my parents, I was, or my siblings, but sometimes you're at school, you're not with your parents and you're not with your siblings, and you need somebody to stabilize you, make you comfortable and get through some of these situations. Well, that book did it for me. And so I realized at that point the power of a story, in particular a story where someone could articulate your feelings well and give you some place to go, even if you didn't have people to talk to about it. And so I carried that all my life. And I do think it had something to do with me falling in love with journalism. When I was a cub reporter of my hometown newspaper in my high school years, writing sports stories and features. But then I went on into journalism. I ended up working for NBC, and I just think I felt like journalism was a kind of activism. It's not something you can say because you want to try to be as objective as possible. But at the same time, you do a story like my wife would do a story on that poverty because she saw it, and because it's meaningful, and because other people should see it, because that's what we're here for. And journalism really is a public service occupation. And so I took all of that, and I recognized what Margaret Atwood said, that a word after word after word is power. And I knew from working in my hometown newspaper, I knew from being able to write my way out of my English class, and my professor in college telling me that I had more talent than that class, and her working with me to write my first novel when I was in college, that I loved using my words. And I loved being able to take my words and say to somebody, see, now I'm writing this for you to read this and understand what I'm talking about. So it's been a lifelong thing. And I knew at some point when I retired from directing television that I was going back to my writing, and that I was still being pulled by the notion that I could change things through books. And there have been any number of people who have done that. I think of Upton Sinclair, The Jungle. He wrote this book about corporations, and particularly meatpacking people, who were creating our food or producing our food in horrible conditions, and the workers were working in terrible conditions. And as the story goes, President Roosevelt was eating his breakfast one day, reading about how the beef and the pork was, being processed. And they say he threw his food out on the White House lawn. I don't know if that's true. But what is true is that he got together with Congress and they created legislation that changed that. That all came from a book. It changed the legislative direction of a country. So when I knew that, I understood the power of the written word. I understood from people telling me that I had possibly the kind of talent that I could put together something, and that I could make people stop and think and reflect. And so that's what I wanted to do when I left NBC, and I wanted to do it with books.
I love it. I love it. And I feel like you're being successful of what I hope you can continue to do that and continue to embrace that method of communication. And my goal just as a virtual book club host or what have you is just to keep sharing both of your novels with anyone that asks. And I know that we have a group of people on tonight. Some are in North Carolina, some are in Tennessee. And I just received a question from Barbara W. And she wanted me to ask you, was the title always Mr. Jimmy from Around the Way?
Hi, Barbara. Yes, it was. And Mr. Jimmy was a gentleman. My grandmother lived in Philadelphia. I can't even begin to tell you how much I loved and adored my grandmother. But she lived in Philadelphia, and she owned a house with a man who was not her husband, who as we know now was gay. But we called him Mr. Jimmy. James Henry Ferguson was his name. And when we would go to their house, in those moments, we didn't have a grandfather on that side. So in those moments, for me, he felt like my grandfather. And he was always full of joy, full of love. He cared for us. We walked in and there were these big hugs and laughter, and he'd do anything for us. And when I started to think about my character and needing a man who people would feel like he cared for them deeply, and he'd be able to show them that he cared for them deeply, and not be afraid to be emotional when necessary to show that care. I knew I had to use Mr. Jimmy, my real Mr. Jimmy, in order to give this character life. And when I came up with the neighborhood, we always used to say in Smithfield, Virginia, or many places in the South, he's from over around the way, and just like that, and and you're supposed to know where that is. But I've always enjoyed that saying. And in fact, we were watching something recently, and I can't remember what. We were watching actually Barack Obama during the convention. And in his speech, he said, "Around the way." He was talking about around the way. Yeah, and he said, "Okay, there we go. That's legitimizing it." But so it's always been, that was always the title. I had the title before I started word number one.
Wow. Interesting. So we only have a couple more minutes till our 40 minutes is up. The time is flying by. Barbara mentioned what a beautiful way to honor a very special person. I agree with that. I wanted to ask a quick question that I want to link to Pat Conroy and all of us from the Beaufort area and elsewhere that help support the Pat Conroy Literary Center understand that in one of his first novels he wrote, The Water is Wide. And it was a memoir. He was actually fired by doing exponential learning, experiential learning, whatever the proper term is. And you have that in the story, how Mr. Jimmy brings the neighborhood children over, and you have the mural on the wall and trying to help probably expand their knowledge of what is outside their neighborhood.
Right.
Where did that idea come from? I have 3 sons, and I was so excited when one of them went to one of those kindergartens where you're doing more activity and hands-on instead of just sitting remotely, and listening. Where did you think to bring that into your storyline?
Well, the Bob books is something we use with our children. That you read about these little books that Mr. Jimmy uses, and we taught our kids to read using those. So I wanted to put that in there. The fact that I was on the board of Reading Partners, which is a national nonprofit, and the whole idea is to make sure that our younger children learn to read. And learn to read well and stay at their grade level. And so being on the board of that organization, which I just love, by the way, and if you want to be a tutor for Reading Partners, you can just go to readingpartners.org and join the force of tutors. But as a member of that community, that became just another thing that I wanted to talk about, was education. And education was huge in my household. My parents, as I said, was a farmer and a school kindergarten teacher. My mother and her co-teacher, Mrs. Ford, which is why Mrs. Ford is a character in the book. My mother and Mrs. Ford used this kindergarten they change our community. We had been people working in fields, working in meatpacking plants and things like that. And after this kindergarten started, the next couple of generations of kids who came from that kindergarten, teachers at the public schools were fighting to get them in their class because we left that kindergarten so ready to learn. And many of us were reading coming out of kindergarten. And those kids became our first doctors and scientists and lawyers, and they came from that little school. And so I wanted to say, here is a little, and people, I even joke about it myself, small, rural, backwoods Smithfield, Virginia town, where you wouldn't expect all these things, these kids to grow up and do these amazing things. But it came because somebody had the idea to sit the kids down and educate them, recognizing that education was going to be a key. It may not solve everything for you, but it does not hurt to have it. And it opens so many more doors. And the story from that little kindergarten, the Martha James Godwin Memorial Kindergarten, tells that tale. And I wanted Mr. Jimmy to be that. I wanted him to come in and see what my mother and Mrs. Ford saw and say, you know what? I need to do something. And it kills me that these little boys came in here. They can't even read what's on the cover. I mean, what's on the box, the chocolate box. It kills me. So I got to do something. And so that's why he sat down to do that. My parents were not college educated. You read my bio. My older brother was at one time the only African-American in charge of and running a nuclear power plant in the United States of America. My middle brother is a world-renowned theologian, president of Union Theological Seminary in Richmond, Virginia, at one time, professor at Princeton Theological Seminary. We came from a small little family in small rural Virginia with two parents who believed in the power of education. And so that's why Mr. Jimmy had to believe in it too.
Right. Fantastic. Yeah. I love it, Jeffrey. You started escalating. Your energy level was getting up tonight.
I'm like, can we just keep talking for a
while?
I
know. I want to keep going. But again, for those of you that are just joining us now, I just want to thank our featured author, Jeffrey Blount. He is a 2-time featured author in our virtual book club. His first novel was The Emancipation of Evan Walls, and we just read Mr. Jimmy from Around the Way. If you haven't read them both, I urge you to get out right away and get a copy. You will love your experience reading his novels. We want to congratulate Mr. Blount for being a grandfather. And
thank you very much.
Want to let you go this evening so that you can rest up for your next shift of whatever your grandparent tasks are going to be. I want to thank Franzen for helping facilitate tonight's book club, and for everyone that's watching live now, and for those of you that might catch the replay. And Jeffrey, I'll be in touch. We will see each other in person finally in March of 2025 in Beaufort, South Carolina.
I look forward to it.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. I'll let you go. Francine, can you stay on for just a last minute recap? And thanks again, Jeffrey. Have a wonderful rest of your visit.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.
Bye. Bye. Wow. Just recapping that. What'd you think, Francine?
Okay. Every time I say this is the best one, but this truly was the best one because he just talks to your heart and soul.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I agree. And he was getting fired up there at the end.
I know. I always thought, gosh, we should have done that at the beginning. But, it was a slow build up. But he's just, I don't know. I don't know when he'll have another book coming out. But he's just the kind of person that when you hear speak, you walk away and you feel really good. Like he just fills your soul with goodness. And you can tell that he's, yeah.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, I thank you for being flexible. I just got a few more comments that I didn't get to read a second ago. Lynn said, thank you to all of us. She had the pleasure of meeting Jeffrey Blount at the Pat Conroy Literary Festival last fall. And Barbara congratulated him on the grandbabies. And then I had a few other people join asking questions saying thank you. And Susan Cushman, yes, it is recorded. You can watch the YouTube link. So I just wanted to talk about what's next. If y'all don't remember, we had to reschedule because of some technology issues. We made it through without any this time. I'm so excited. But we rescheduled. That's why we just had this meeting tonight. And we're currently reading another novel, or excuse me, a memoir or a collection of stories. It's a collection of 26 stories by women about hiking, backpacking, trail running, and mountaineering. And we talk about inspiration. You can get it from activism literature. You can get it from blood, sweat, and tears. And I think that the cover is very interesting, and I just want to see if anybody notices what the flowers might represent. And we'll talk about that on September 26th at 7 p.m. East Coast time. Francine speaking.
I just can't. I have to put my glass on. So
We can talk about it
flowers.
later. We can talk about it later.
Okay.
It's a tease so that people come back and have the conversation with Christine. She actually edited the stories.
Mhm.
We featured her before in her book. It was about a memoir similar to other hiking, finding yourself experiences for solo women hikers. And I'm excited to have her back once she gets off the big trail in Vermont, I believe is where she's currently hiking. So Francine, do you have anything else to add before we sign off for the evening?
I don't. Thank you, people, for joining us. This was a fantastic conversation. Thank you for having me co-host. I love doing this. I will happily change my schedule for you, Susie.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being a member of an active member of the virtual book club. And remember, the more feedback we have within the Facebook group amongst us is the more exciting for all of us. So don't go away. We've been here for almost 4 years now. We're going to keep on going. And thanks a lot, Francine. Everybody have a good night.
Thanks, Susie.
Thanks. I'm going to end the stream now. Take care.